Emily loved spending her free hours in the school library. It was her sanctuary, a place filled with hidden stories, buried secrets, and the comforting smell of aged paper. Today, she wandered between shelves, feeling the worn book spines under her fingertips, waiting for something to catch her eye. She noticed a small notebook with a simple brown cover peeking out from behind a stack of dusty history books. Curious, she picked it up, flipping through its pages, expecting notes or doodles from a previous student. Surprisingly, it seemed familiar, almost identical to her own notebook at home, where she jotted down her thoughts and observations. She slipped it into her bag without a second thought, eager to read it later. That night, when she opened the notebook in her bedroom, her stomach dropped. The first entry, written in a neat hand, was addressed to her. Today, you'll find this notebook and begin to learn things you never expected. At first, Emily chuckled. It must be some coincidence, she thought, a prank or an old notebook someone wrote for fun. She read further and found more entries about small events, like her walking down the hallway after lunch or sitting under her favorite tree by the playground. The details were startlingly accurate. The entry that chilled her most described her friend Sam visiting her the next day, wearing his signature red cap, and asking to borrow her favorite book on Egyptian mythology. Emily reread it, unsettled, wondering if someone was watching her, or she'd been reading too many mystery novels. She resolved to take the notebook to school and show it to Sam. The next day, Emily found herself constantly glancing at her bag, where the notebook lay hidden. The school day dragged on until lunch, when she saw Sam making his way toward her, wearing his red cap, just as the entry had described. Her pulse quickened as he approached, looking down at the book she held. "Hey, can I borrow that? You know, the one on Egyptian mythology." Emily felt a mix of excitement and dread as she handed it over. She could hardly wait to tell him about the notebook, but felt a strange reluctance. Instead, she waited until after school, when they met by their usual spot near the old oak tree. She opened the notebook, showed Sam the entries, and explained what had happened. His brow furrowed, and he looked between her and the notebook with a mix of curiosity and concern. "It's like the notebook's watching you," he joked, but his tone lacked conviction. "Maybe someone's playing a prank." Emily shook her head, flipping through more pages. The entries continued to hint at small future events, each written with uncanny precision. A prickling sense of unease took root as she realized how much of her life had been recorded within these pages. Sam tried to reassure her, though he seemed uneasy himself, offering to keep an eye on her if she felt nervous. But as the day passed, her fascination with the notebook grew stronger, blending with a tinge of dread. That night, Emily lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the notebook resting on her nightstand. The entries she'd read kept playing in her mind. They described her life with an eerie precision. She remembered Sam's suggestion that it could be a prank, but who would go through the effort to follow her every move, predicting her day-to-day life in such detail? The thought made her skin crawl. Determined to prove she wasn't under the notebook's control, she resolved to defy its next prediction. The following entry read, "Tomorrow, during lunch, you'll walk over to the south courtyard to meet Sam, who will show you something he found." She'd intended to visit the south courtyard, a quiet spot perfect for lunch breaks, but now she was dead set against it. Instead, she'd go to the north side of the school, where Sam never ventured. The next day, Emily felt a sense of determination as she purposefully made her way to the north courtyard during lunch. She waited, watching for any sign of Sam, and was about to declare her plan a success when she saw him walking toward her, holding up an old coin he'd found. "Emily, I was looking for you. Look at this." Her heart skipped a beat. Somehow, despite her best efforts, the notebook's prediction had come true. She felt a chill as she took the coin from Sam's hand, wondering how this was possible. She explained her attempt to defy the notebook, but Sam just shrugged, chalking it up to chance. But Emily knew better. The notebook wasn't just some harmless prank. It had an unsettling hold over her life that she couldn't easily shake off. Later that day, still rattled from her failed attempt to alter the notebook's prediction, Emily visited the school library, hoping to find some distraction. Mrs. Gray, the librarian, was a quiet but perceptive woman with an air of mystery about her. Emily often wondered about her past and how she came to work at their small-town school. As Emily wandered the aisles, Mrs. Gray approached her, her eyes flicking to the notebook that Emily had clutched tightly to her chest. "Is that your journal, dear?" Mrs. Gray asked, her tone gentle yet probing. Emily hesitated, debating whether to confide in her. "Not exactly. It's something I found here," she admitted cautiously. Mrs. Gray's gaze sharpened. "Some things are better left undiscovered," she said softly, almost to herself. "Not everything in this library is meant to be read." The cryptic response left Emily with a mix of curiosity and fear. Mrs. Gray seemed to know more than she was letting on, and her warning sent a chill through Emily. She had been coming to the library for years, but this was the first time she felt as if it held secrets beyond books and dusty shelves. Despite the unease gnawing at her, Emily couldn't resist the notebook's pull. She knew she should leave it behind, heed Mrs. Gray's warning, and return to a life free from eerie predictions. Yet, deep down, a part of her wanted to understand the mystery that bound her to this strange journal. As Mrs. Gray turned back to her duties, Emily clutched the notebook tighter, feeling as if it were whispering secrets only she could hear. As the days passed, Emily continued to read the notebook's entries, and each new prediction seemed more accurate than the last. The sense of inevitability it created began to gnaw at her, casting a shadow over her days. But something else started to bother her. Sam had been avoiding her. Whenever they crossed paths, he seemed distant, looking away, or offering only brief, awkward conversations. One afternoon, Emily finally confronted him by their favorite oak tree after school. "Sam, are you mad at me or something?" she asked, unable to keep the worry out of her voice. Sam shifted uncomfortably, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's just this notebook thing, Emily. It's weird, you know? You're acting like it controls you." Emily bristled, though she couldn't deny his words. "It doesn't control me. I need to figure out why it predicts things about my life." He sighed, his expression softening with a hint of concern. "It's changing you, Em. You're obsessed with it." He paused, looking at her carefully. "Maybe it's best if you let it go." But Emily couldn't let it go. As Sam walked away, his words left her feeling even more isolated. The notebook was taking over her thoughts. Yes, but it was also the only link to a mystery that she felt compelled to solve. Losing Sam hurt, but losing the chance to understand the notebook felt unthinkable. That evening, Emily's frustration with Sam turned into a fierce determination to get to the bottom of the notebook's origins. She began by searching the library records for anything that might shed light on Mrs. Gray's cryptic warning. She dug through old files and records in a dusty back corner of a library, hoping for a clue. Finally, after hours of searching, she came across a worn school journal from decades past. Flipping through the pages, she discovered an entry that stopped her cold. It detailed the experiences of another student who had supposedly found a notebook of predictions just like hers. The student had described feeling a similar mix of fascination and fear, with events unfolding exactly as they had for Emily. Her mind raced with questions. How many others had this happened to? Was the notebook some kind of cursed object? She quickly scanned the rest of the journal, but found only fragments of information before the entries abruptly ended. Emily wondered if Mrs. Gray might have known this student. Perhaps, she thought, Mrs. Gray had once held the notebook herself, bound by the same eerie connection. The discovery both thrilled and terrified her. She had long suspected the notebook was more than just a strange coincidence, but now she felt as if she was part of a larger, darker pattern. Emily resolved to ask Mrs. Gray directly, though she sensed the librarian might not be willing to share everything. Regardless, the notebook's mystery had become too deep to walk away from, even if it meant risking her friendship with Sam and facing the fear Mrs. Gray had tried to instill. The next day, after school, Emily found Mrs. Gray alone in the library, shelving books. She took a deep breath and approached, feeling both nervous and determined. "Mrs. Gray, I found an old journal about a student who had a notebook like mine. Did you know about this?" Mrs. Gray froze, her gaze shifting to Emily with a sharp intensity. After a long pause, she sighed, as if deciding to reveal a burden she'd carried for years. "Yes, Emily," she said quietly. "I knew him. He was a student here long ago, a lot like you, curious, bright, and fascinated with history. But that notebook," she trailed off, her eyes darkening. "It's not a gift, Emily. It binds you, and it takes more than you can imagine." Emily shivered, clutching her notebook tighter. "What do you mean takes? What happened to him?" Mrs. Gray hesitated before speaking in a low voice. "He tried to escape it too, but in the end, he had to make a terrible sacrifice to free himself. Some things aren't meant to be known, Emily. This notebook, it shows us what's coming, but at a great cost." The words echoed in Emily's mind. What kind of sacrifice had he made? And could she avoid that fate herself? Mrs. Gray's warning left her shaken, but a part of her still resisted letting go. She had come this far, and now more than ever, she felt compelled to understand the full extent of the notebook's power. Armed with Mrs. Gray's ominous words, Emily resolved to find out once and for all if she could defy the notebook. She devised a plan, a test that would prove, without a doubt, whether the notebook truly controlled her fate. The notebook's latest entry predicted that, after school, she would take the long route home through the woods, where she'd find a key lying in her path. To defy it, she set out with a specific plan. She would take a completely different route, one that would ensure she avoided the woods altogether. As she left school, she walked briskly toward the main road, choosing to pass by the park instead of going anywhere near the forest path. She felt a sense of triumph as she continued along her chosen route, feeling that she'd finally outwitted the notebook's hold. But then, her phone rang. It was Sam, his voice panicked. "Emily, I lost my house key somewhere. Can you check near the woods? I think it might have fallen there." Her heart sank. Despite everything, she found herself making her way toward the woods. Her resolve wavered, but she told herself she was doing it for Sam, not because of the notebook's prediction. When she reached the forest path, her stomach twisted as she spotted a small, silver key lying on the ground, just as the notebook had foretold. Defeated, Emily picked it up, feeling more trapped than ever. Her attempt to defy the notebook had failed, reinforcing her fear that it held an inescapable power over her. She returned the key to Sam in silence, too shaken to explain her experiment. As she walked away, the reality of Mrs. Gray's warning sank in. The notebook's predictions were not just uncanny coincidences, they were impossible to avoid. And the more she tried to resist, the more she felt herself slipping into a future she couldn't control. Emily felt a growing sense of isolation as the notebook's predictions became an unshakable part of her life. Sam, once her closest confidant, had drifted further away, uneasy about her obsession. One afternoon, unable to ignore the distance between them any longer, Emily sought him out by the oak tree. "Sam, we need to talk," she began, her voice tentative but steady. He looked at her warily, crossing his arms. "This notebook, it's taking over my life. I tried to defy it, I really did, but it's like every prediction comes true no matter what I do." Sam exhaled deeply, frustration clear in his expression. "Emily, it's not the notebook making these things happen. It's you. You're so focused on it that you're letting it control you." The words stung, but she knew he was trying to reach her. "I don't want it to control me, but Mrs. Gray told me about someone else who had this notebook. She said it required a sacrifice to break free." Sam shook his head. "You're acting like it's some curse, but it's just a notebook, Emily. You don't need to believe in it so much." She felt a pang of hurt, realizing Sam couldn't understand the hold it had on her. As he walked away, she was left standing alone, more convinced than ever that the notebook's power was real. And if breaking free truly required sacrifice, she needed to understand exactly what that meant. Determined to find answers, Emily approached Mrs. Gray in the library once again, this time prepared to ask for her help directly. "Mrs. Gray, I need to know the truth," she said, her voice low but resolute. What kind of sacrifice did that student make to escape the notebook? Mrs. Gray's face softened with an emotion Emily couldn't quite place. Sympathy mixed with regret. Emily, some knowledge comes at a price. But if you're determined, I can help you. Though it may come at a cost you're not prepared for. The warning unsettled her, but Emily nodded. Mrs. Gray reluctantly guided her to a small, locked room at the back of the library, one she had never noticed before. Inside, dust-covered boxes lined the shelves, each marked with the names of former students. Mrs. Gray pulled down a box labeled with the name of the boy she had mentioned, a boy who, like Emily, had been consumed by the notebook's predictions. Inside the box, Emily found faded notes, torn journal pages, and a final letter written by the boy. The letter detailed his desperation, his failed attempts to defy the notebook, and ultimately, his decision to give up something he loved most in order to be free. Mrs. Gray explained softly he sacrificed his greatest passion, his love for storytelling. He never wrote again. The notebook seemed to demand something precious, a piece of himself, as the cost of freedom. Emily's chest tightened as she considered what she might have to give up. Her curiosity, her need to understand mysteries, her love for uncovering secrets. Could she willingly abandon those parts of herself? Mrs. Gray watched her carefully. Think carefully, Emily. Sometimes the answer we seek is less about what we're willing to give up and more about why we can't let go. The words lingered in Emily's mind as she left the library, feeling the weight of the decision she would eventually need to make. She realized that her obsession with the notebook had not just isolated her from her friends, it had begun to consume her sense of self. But could she bring herself to make a sacrifice that deep? Emily returned home that evening with a heavy heart, clutching the notebook as though it held her fate within its pages. She flipped through it almost mechanically until a new entry caught her attention, stopping her breath short. The prediction read, "Tomorrow, you will face a choice that will alter everything. But beware, this choice comes with consequences." As she read on, her heart pounded. The entry detailed an event that involved Sam, an accident that would happen if she didn't intervene. The prediction was chillingly specific, down to the moment and location. If it was true, Sam could be in real danger. Emily's mind raced. If she told Sam, he'd likely dismiss it as just another figment of her obsession. But if she did nothing, and the prediction came true, she didn't want to even think about that possibility. The thought of Sam getting hurt because of the notebook sent a chill through her. She didn't know if she could bear the weight of doing nothing. But was her intervention exactly what the notebook expected? As she struggled with her thoughts, she knew this moment was the ultimate test of her ability to break free from the notebook's influence, or else fall victim to its control completely. The next morning, Emily waited anxiously outside the library, her mind focused on the prediction about Sam. Her decision had solidified in the dark hours of the night. She would destroy the notebook. If it held so much power over her life, then breaking free was worth any cost. After school, she gathered materials to burn it, old matches, lighter fluid, and found an isolated spot by the edge of the woods where no one would disturb her. She opened the notebook one last time, flipping through its pages as the entries about her life stared back at her. Each one seemed like a tether, binding her to a future she hadn't chosen. Her fingers shook as she dripped lighter fluid over the pages. She hesitated, realizing how much of her time and thoughts had been consumed by its predictions, her desire for control slowly eroding her sense of self. She thought of Mrs. Gray's words. Sometimes the answer we seek is less about what we're willing to give up and more about why we can't let go. With a final look at the notebook, she struck a match and let it fall onto the pages. The flames flickered to life, devouring each word that had haunted her. The crackle of burning paper filled the silence around her, and Emily watched as each prediction turned to ash. For a moment, a strange calm washed over her, and she felt a weight lifting, the tension that had bound her to the notebook releasing. But as she stood by the smoldering ashes, she realized the decision to burn it might have only been the beginning. The predictions might be gone, but what remained were the consequences of the time she had lost and the people she had pushed away. With a deep breath, she walked away from the clearing, ready to rebuild her life and reconnect with the friends she'd neglected. However, a part of her remained wary, wondering if she had truly broken free, or if her sacrifice would only reveal its cost in time. In the days following the destruction of the notebook, Emily felt an unexpected sense of relief. Without its predictions haunting her, her mind was finally free to focus on her friendships and her own interests. She reached out to Sam, apologizing for how distant she'd become and explaining that she had let go of the notebook's hold on her life. Sam listened, his skepticism softening as he saw the change in her demeanor. "So it's really gone?" he asked, watching her carefully. "Yes," Emily replied, her voice steady. "I burned it, and I think I'm free from whatever control it had over me." Despite her words, a part of her remained wary, as if expecting some lingering consequence to emerge. Slowly, her friendship with Sam began to mend. They spent afternoons talking about things unrelated to the notebook, laughing, and rediscovering the ease they'd once shared. Yet every so often, Emily would feel an odd sense of emptiness, as though a piece of her life was missing. She tried to ignore it, focusing instead on rebuilding the life she'd almost lost. One afternoon, as she and Sam sat under their favorite oak tree, he asked, "Do you think that notebook really held some kind of curse?" Emily paused, uncertain. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I do know it made me lose sight of what mattered most. I think the curse was my own obsession with knowing what would happen." As they sat in the fading sunlight, Emily felt a cautious optimism that maybe, finally, the notebook was behind her for good. With the notebook gone, Emily found herself returning to old habits she'd once loved. She visited the library frequently, now with a fresh perspective, appreciating the books without searching for hidden messages or mysteries. Mrs. Gray noticed her return and gave a nod of approval, as if acknowledging that Emily had made the right choice. Emily threw herself into her studies, spending time with Sam and other friends, exploring the world without the haunting sense of fate the notebook had imposed on her. Her life felt lighter, each day a blank slate filled only with possibilities she could shape herself. One day, while helping Mrs. Gray organize some of the library's older books, Emily asked her about the student she mentioned, the one who had also owned a similar notebook. "Do you think he ever found peace?" Emily asked quietly. Mrs. Gray gave her a long, thoughtful look. "I believe he did, once he learned to let go," she replied. "Sometimes, Emily, the hardest things to leave behind are the things we think define us. But often, it's in letting go that we find our true selves." Emily nodded, feeling the truth in Mrs. Gray's words. She had clung to the notebook out of a desire for control, to know her future, but it was only after she let it go that she began to see who she truly was: curious, brave, and in control of her own life. As she walked home that day, she marveled at how different the world looked without the weight of the notebook's predictions. The town felt brighter, her friends more precious, her future wide open. A few weeks after the notebook was gone, Emily's life had settled into a peaceful routine. She felt happier and more grounded, as though she'd reclaimed a part of herself that had been overshadowed by the notebook's influence. Yet, one afternoon, as she was tidying her room, she noticed something strange among the ashes she'd saved from the notebook's remains: one small, untouched page. Her heart skipped a beat as she picked it up, the edges slightly singed, but the text clear and intact. She could scarcely believe it. She had been certain the entire notebook had burned away. Her fingers trembled as she read the single line written across the page: "Your story is far from over." Emily's pulse quickened, a mix of fear and excitement stirring within her. She wasn't sure what the message meant, but she knew that whatever she faced, she was no longer the same girl who had been consumed by the notebook's predictions. She had learned to question, to confront, and to let go. As she tucked the page into her journal, she smiled to herself, realizing that the power to shape her life lay not in predictions, but in her own choices. And with that newfound freedom, she felt ready to face whatever the future held. Emily's life continued, marked by a subtle but profound change in her perspective. She embraced each day with a curiosity and resilience born from her experience with the notebook. She noticed small things she might have overlooked before: the warmth of sunlight on her face, the laughter of her friends, the simple joys that filled her world. Her friendship with Sam was stronger than ever, and they often spoke about the notebook and the impact it had on her. One afternoon, as they walked by the lake near town, Sam asked, "Do you ever wonder what might have happened if you hadn't burned it?" Emily considered the question, a faint smile on her lips. "I think it would have kept controlling me. I would have stayed so focused on the future that I'd miss out on everything happening now." Together, they stood by the water, reflecting on the journey she had taken. Emily realized she had grown in ways she couldn't have imagined. She no longer needed to know what lay ahead. The uncertainty had become a source of freedom, not fear. As they headed home, Emily felt a deep sense of peace. The notebook had left its mark on her life, but she had ultimately taken back control. She was ready to move forward, her story unwritten, and her choices truly her own. Hey, everyone, if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like to support us. We'd love to know what part of the story had the biggest impact on you, so please let us know in the comments below. Was it the mystery of the notebook, the sacrifices Emily faced, or the final twist? Also, we'd love to hear your ideas. If there's a story, theme, or concept you'd like to see on this channel, leave your suggestions in the comments. Your feedback helps us bring more stories to life that you'll love. Thank you for being part of our community, and stay tuned for more thrilling tales.